Which is why sharing stories of faith like this one is so important and valuable, because they aren't just stories. They invite us into a living faith in a God who rescues. You know, as Moses sort of toddled into Pharaoh's household, he could have walked away from the story of God, couldn't he? But he didn't. Now that new king, Pharaoh, he is a nasty piece of work, isn't he? Now over the last few weeks, we've been looking at the story of Esther, another story in the Bible where, that story as well has painted a very scary picture for God's people. In fact, we left that story last week with a day looming ever nearer, where it looked like maybe God's people are going to be wiped out. There are some powers that be that seem very keen on stopping God's story in its tracks. And it looks like that King Pharaoh, this Pharaoh, wants to join in on the action of stopping God's story. Now, who thinks it's scary at the moment to be a part of God's story in the story that we've just heard read out? Yeah, I think it looks a little bit scary. What is it that makes it scary? Well, there's this Pharaoh who has a story of his own, but his story can't happen unless God's story is stopped. Pharaoh has a story of his own, and the self-centered story that he wants for himself doesn't work if God's story goes ahead. Now, we were just singing a song, weren't we, that had a lot of words. Well done for keeping up. I know it was hard work. It was a lot of skipping over history there as well. But can we remember what that song told us about what God's plans were? Can anyone remember what God's plans were? It came up a lot in the chorus. Can we remember? Anyone? Yeah? Yeah? Yeah, there was blessing. Yeah, God's people in, yeah? God's people, yeah, in God's place, under his rule, enjoying God's blessing. So that's God's plan for his people. To be part of God's story is to enjoy his care and his rule. Pharaoh's plan, on the other hand, is a bit different. He wants to put he wants to put this story here into the bin. So I've got a little bin here. We're not going to put it there at the moment. We'll see if it happens, because that's what Pharaoh wants. But Pharaoh's plan is, he wants God's people in Pharaoh's place, under Pharaoh's rule, enjoying Pharaoh's... Wasn't really blessing, was it? No. He wants them to be joining in on his building project. He wants them to be building his great cities, his store cities. Pharaoh isn't just a bully in this story. He's painted as someone who is utterly against God. He resents God's people, he rejects God's promises, and he resists God's plan to bring life and blessing. Now, we've heard of some of the horrible ways in which he tries to wipe out God's story, haven't we? Because he brings in slavery and death. That's what his story, Pharaoh's story, looks like. It's a scary story of slavery and death. And it gets worse as the story goes on. This is an incredibly uncomfortable and scary place to be a follower of God. Now, if we want to be part of God's story, God's plan, how are we supposed to keep going when there are powers that be that don't want God's story to continue? When being part of God's story makes life very uncomfortable, even dangerous. We were introduced to those two midwives, weren't we? Shiphrah and Puah. Now, Pharaoh gives them an incredibly distressing task. He doesn't want any of the Hebrew boys to pose a threat to him and to his story. And so he wants them, disposed of. And he wants Shiphrah and Puah to be the ones who make that happen. These women are in a deeply dangerous position, aren't they, if they don't follow through. You can imagine what they envision Pharaoh doing to them if they don't do what he wants them to. And yet when confronted with this choice of life or death, well, they choose life, but they don't choose their lives, do they? They choose the lives of those they've been invited to care for. Their willingness to choose that sort of costly care is what makes their name so fitting. Beautiful care is costly. Now, kids, I imagine you know what it's like to be cared for, what it's like to have meals on the table, toys perhaps tidied away. You might play a small part in that, but I suspect there are others in your household who might do a little bit more. But lots of other ways as well. I wonder if you have noticed how costly that care is that you get. That care comes often because your loved ones choose your life rather than theirs. They choose your life above their own. That was the opposite of what our Pharaoh, that Pharaoh king, was doing, isn't it? Costly care is a price that families and communities are invited to bear because, well, from your mother's womb, you are deeply valuable and precious. And not just precious to us, but precious to God as well. We saw that play out in why Shiphrah and Puah chose this costly care. They were faithful to God. They feared God. They had this very scary Pharaoh right in front of their faces. They could have very easily feared him, right? And yet it wasn't Pharaoh's command that they chose to follow. Because they understood that following God is always the safest thing to do. Not because he's a scary tyrant like Pharaoh, but because he's a God who wants life for those he's made. Now, a lot of ink has been spilt over how to evaluate the story that these women spin when they're sort of confronted by a no doubt very grumpy Pharaoh, who asks the questions, why have you let these children live? I wonder if you heard it. The midwives answered, well, Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They've got them out before we get there. I imagine Pharaoh's not been in the room for any of his little ones when they've come along. It's a rather ridiculous lie. And yet it seems to go rather over the head of this rather dim-witted Pharaoh's head. I mean, if this were reality, why would they need midwives in the first place? Maybe spurred on by a confident faith in God, these women are making a sport of Pharaoh, this not God. Whatever we think about the story that they shared, God was kind to them. And for a second time, Pharaoh's plan to stop God's story in its tracks, well, it fails, doesn't it? Because the population grows and grows even more. The two midwives are given families of their own. Sadly, though, that doesn't stop Pharaoh. Instead, he doubles down to stop God's story in its tracks. And as he does that, though, we hear about a special baby being born into a terrifying moment in God's story, to an ordinary family. So we go back to that question, how are we supposed to keep going when there are powers that be that don't want God's story to continue? We hear the story of a mother's courageous care. Now in Hebrews, which is a letter in the New Testament, we hear that it was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. They were not afraid of the king's edict. So as we see this story sort of playing out for us, we're going to see an extraordinary story of faith, not fear. So how are we supposed to keep going? How are we invited to care for those in our families and in our wider church? Well, by faith, not by fear. That said, every moment, I'm sure, of this must have been utterly gut-wrenching for this family. Even if life is what comes out at the end of it, it's a deeply painful story, isn't it? Now, when it's no longer possible to keep the little baby boy hidden at home, she gives him over to the Lord in faith, and she makes, his mother makes a little basket. A little basket. She waterproofs the basket, and she places him carefully inside, and she places him in the very place that Pharaoh intended to be the end of him, to bring about his end. The word, though, I wonder if you know, the word that the writer uses for this basket, it comes up one other place in the Bible. Can anyone think of another story that involves someone being brought through the waters to life? Noah's Ark. Yeah, Ark. So the story for basket is Ark. It's the same one as in the story of Noah and the Ark. Because this isn't only a story of a mother's care. We've got used to seeing God's hidden hand at work as we've been going through Esther. I wonder if we notice it as we've been reading through this story as well. Because clearly this isn't all down to a mother's care. We're also invited to see the hidden hand of God at bringing salvation in this story. Now Moses' sister, she sticks around, and how quickly do you think her heart would have been beating when she saw someone coming along to where this baby was hidden? What do you think your heart would have been doing? Do you think it would be going... Yeah, and then she notices it's no other than someone from Pharaoh's household. Oh my goodness! This is terrifying, isn't it? What's going to happen? Pharaoh had condemned this child to death. And we have one of Pharaoh's family coming. And yet, wonderfully, the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter, no less, is the one who leads to life. There's a beautiful compassion that comes from a very unexpected person in a very unexpected place. Moses' sister jumps up and amazingly, she managed to orchestrate things. She did, who knows? So that Moses goes back to his mother to be looked after and paid for it as well. At least for a time. And then when he's older, he gets taken into Pharaoh's household and is looked after by Pharaoh's daughter. He ends up in a very unexpected place, and yet he's safe, isn't he? Not to grow up as a slave, but as a son in the very household that wanted him destroyed. How are we, going back to the question, how are we supposed to keep going when we rub up against those who want to stop God's story in its tracks? All of us are rubbing against that, young and old. Following Jesus is an uncomfortable journey. Thankfully, we probably aren't going to come up against quite the levels of Pharaoh. But we will rub up against people who think we should go their way rather than Jesus' way, rather than God's way. And who will make it very uncomfortable for us if we don't. Who will make us feel small or silly or afraid. I wonder what it would have been like for Moses on the school playground. It's hard. Which is why sharing stories of faith like this one is so important and valuable, because they aren't just stories. They invite us into a living faith in a God who rescues. You know, as Moses sort of toddled into Pharaoh's household, he could have walked away from the story of God, couldn't he? But he didn't. Because he knew the God of this story. He'd been with his mother and his community long enough to hear that story, to see his parents live it out in faith. That's why we share the stories of Jesus and live it out at home and here together, because it's only by faith in the God of this story that we won't get caught up in fear when it looks like life is going to go off the rails. Pharaoh had two strategies for stopping God's story in his tracks: slavery and death. And yet God raised up a rescuer for his people. And he rescued them from both. We get to see a snapshot of this as this sort of Moses grows up. And we see his story of the Exodus, the story of God's people in the Exodus. Traveling once again through the waters, not to slavery and death, but to life. Life with God. But we see God's rescue most fully in the story of the Saviour Jesus, who, remember we had the ark. Remember, see if this fits in here. Does this fit in here? I don't know. I didn't practice this bit. Never mind. Who went to that place of death. Who went to that place of death, the cross, and yet passed through death to bring us to life. So in one sense, we're invited to jump on board on Jesus, to be carried through death and into life, to be part of God's story and plan. Now, just as we draw to a close, we've seen something of the beautiful care of the likes of the midwives and Moses' mother and sister and Pharaoh's daughter. Now, I'm sure each of us have experienced something of that care in our stories as well, in different ways. God honours that sort of care. That's one of the reasons why we have these stories. That's why we get told the names of Shiphrah and Puah. They're there as to sort of be passed down through the generations. But he doesn't just honour care like this, a care sort of in mothering-like ways. He shows us where it comes from. Because this sort of care doesn't sort of come out of nowhere. It comes because we've been made in his image. This sort of costly, compassionate care gives us a glimpse into God's care for us. We see it jumping out in all sorts of places, but it's most clear at the cross, isn't it? So how can we keep going? Well, because we have a God who cares for us deeply. He cares for you deeply. And his costly love at the cross shows us that. And he isn't going to let, his plan for us get scuppered in any way. He didn't in Moses' story and the story in Egypt, and he won't for us either.